May 8th, 1942. The warm turquoise waters of the Coral Sea churned with the black oil and floating debris of naval combat. For Vice Admiral Chuichi Hara, aboard the Japanese carrier Zuikaku, the scene below was one of calculated, hard-won victory. His pilots, the elite of the Imperial Japanese Navy's air arm, had just concluded a brutal exchange with the American Task Force 17. The air was still thick with the metallic scent of cordite and the lingering smoke from their own damaged carrier, the Shokaku, which had been savaged by American dive bombers. But the price they had paid was worth the prize they had claimed. Through the scattered clouds, observers and returning pilots confirmed the news that was now crackling over the radios and being relayed to the high command. The American carrier, USS Yorktown, was a burning wreck. Multiple direct hits had torn through her flight deck, and a massive 250-kilogram bomb had detonated deep within her hull, extinguishing her boilers and leaving her dead in the water. She was listing, smoke pouring from her island, a mortally wounded beast. The Japanese pilots who had delivered the blows were certain. They had seen the secondary explosions, the frantic scurrying of the American sailors, the telltale signs of a ship in its death throes. No vessel could survive that kind of punishment. They had, for all intents and purposes, sunk her. Admiral Hara and his superior, Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, could report back to Combined Fleet Headquarters with confidence. One of the precious few American carriers in the Pacific was now at the bottom of the sea, or would be soon enough. The strategic balance had shifted decisively in their favor. They couldn't believe how vulnerable the Americans had been, and their sense of martial pride swelled. The path to Midway and the final annihilation of the American Pacific Fleet was now clear. The story of how that confidence was shattered is one of the most stunning chapters of the Pacific War. If you want more deep dives into the events that truly defined the Second World War, be sure to subscribe to WW2 Insight and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss what's coming. This Japanese confidence was not born from a single victory. It was the product of a worldview, a carefully constructed national and military ideology that permeated every level of Japanese society. For decades, the Empire of Japan had been taught to see itself as a divine nation. Its people possessed of a unique spiritual strength known as Yamato Damashii. This Japanese spirit was believed to be an invincible force, capable of overcoming any material or numerical disadvantage. Their naval doctrine was built upon this very principle. The strategy of Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle, was the IJN's holy writ. It envisioned a single, epic naval engagement in which the technologically superior and spiritually hardened Japanese fleet would annihilate its American counterpart in a glorious clash. Just as Admiral Togo had done to the Russians at Tsushima in 1905, they knew America was an industrial giant. They were not ignorant of the sprawling factories of Detroit or the vast steel mills of Pennsylvania. But they viewed this strength as a weakness. American society, their propaganda insisted, was decadent, soft, and individualistic. It was a nation of merchants and farmers, not warriors. Americans lacked the stomach for a bloody, protracted war and the spiritual fortitude for true sacrifice. They would build many ships, yes, but their crews would be poorly trained, their commanders unimaginative, and their will to fight would crumble after the first shocking defeats. The attack on Pearl Harbor was designed not just to cripple the fleet, but to shatter this fragile American morale. And for 6 months, it seemed their predictions were flawlessly accurate. From the Philippines to Singapore, from the Dutch East Indies to the Bay of Bengal, the banner of the rising sun advanced, brushing aside Allied resistance with humiliating ease. The Japanese military laughed at the initial American response, which seemed clumsy and slow. They were utterly convinced that the war would follow their script, culminating in a decisive battle where their superior skill and spirit would triumph. The idea that America could not only withstand the shock, but adapt and innovate at a speed that defied belief was simply not part of their calculus. They never knew that the true American strength wasn't just in its factories, but in the mindset those factories fostered, a culture of practical, relentless, problem-solving ingenuity. This American reality, the unspoken policy that would ultimately stun the Japanese high command, was forged in the smoke and fire of December 7th, 1941. As the last of Nagumo's aircraft winged their way back to their carriers, they left behind a scene of apocalyptic devastation at Pearl Harbor. Battleships, the pride of the fleet, were sunk at their moorings, twisted into grotesque sculptures of steel. The naval base was a graveyard. For the Japanese, this was the crippling blow from which the Americans would not recover for a year, perhaps two. But as the smoke cleared, a different spirit began to move among the wreckage. It wasn't the spirit of defeat, but one of furious, pragmatic resolve. When the new commander of the Pacific Fleet, Admiral Chester Nimitz, arrived and surveyed the carnage, he made a statement that would define the American war effort. Looking at the sunken hulls of the USS California and USS West Virginia, he remarked to an aide, "You know, a lot of those ships can be salvaged." It was a simple, almost breathtakingly understated observation. Where the Japanese saw a tomb, Nimitz saw a repair yard. This was the genesis of the American approach. It was a policy born of desperation. With their battleship fleet shattered, every single remaining asset, especially the handful of aircraft carriers that had escaped the attack by chance, was now priceless. They could not afford to lose a single one. This necessity gave birth to a culture of salvage and repair that was unprecedented in the history of naval warfare. The Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard, once a sleepy peacetime facility, became a 24/7 hive of activity. Thousands of civilian workers, welders, engineers, electricians, mechanics descended on the base, driven by a quiet fury. They were not warriors in the Japanese sense, but they were armed with slide rules, blueprints, and a can-do attitude that was its own form of fighting spirit. They cut away wreckage, patched holes, and resurrected ships the enemy had confidently written off as total losses. This wasn't a grand top-down military doctrine. It was a grassroots, problem-solving ethos. It was the spirit of the assembly line applied to the art of war. And it was about to give the Japanese admirals a lesson they would never forget. They thought they had crippled a navy. They had, in fact, awakened a continent-spanning machine shop. In the weeks following the Coral Sea engagement, the intelligence flowing into Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's Combined Fleet headquarters seemed to confirm every one of their strategic assumptions. American naval communications, which they monitored closely, were filled with chatter about catastrophic damage to the Yorktown. Their own pilots' after-action reports were unequivocal. The ship was gone. Based on this concrete evidence, the intricate plan for Operation MI, the invasion of Midway Atoll, was finalized. It was a masterpiece of strategic complexity, designed to be the final act in the Pacific War. A diversionary force would strike the Aleutian Islands, drawing the American fleet north. Then, the main carrier strike force, the Kido Butai, under the command of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, would smash Midway's defenses. When the remaining American carriers they calculated only two were operational, Hornet and Enterprise rushed out to respond. They would sail straight into the jaws of a massive trap. Yamamoto himself, aboard the super battleship Yamato, would be waiting with the main body of the fleet to deliver the coup de grace. The mood aboard the Japanese carriers, as they sortied from Hashirajima Bay, was one of supreme, almost arrogant confidence. They were the victors of Pearl Harbor, the conquerors of the South Pacific. Their Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters were the terror of the skies, and their pilots were battle-hardened veterans who had known nothing but victory. They laughed at the thought of the beleaguered American fleet. They were sailing to their destiny, to the Kantai Kessen that would break America's will to fight and secure the Japanese Empire for 1,000 years. They had meticulously planned for every contingency, except one: the possibility that their fundamental understanding of their enemy was catastrophically wrong. They were sailing to hunt a two-carrier fleet, a wounded and predictable foe. The thought that they were heading into an ambush, set by a resurrected ghost, was beyond the realm of imagination. The morning of June 4th, 1942, dawned bright and clear over the Central Pacific. The first wave of Japanese aircraft had roared off the decks of Nagumo's four carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, to pound the American installation on Midway. The initial reports were good. The attack was proceeding as planned. But then, the first ripples of uncertainty began to disturb the placid confidence on the bridge of the flagship Akagi. A report from a floatplane, launched late from the cruiser Tone, indicated the presence of American ships. A follow-up message clarified the terrifying reality. One of the ships was a carrier. Nagumo and his staff were stunned, but their doctrine had prepared them for this. The plan was working, the American fleet had taken the bait. But their entire operational calculus was based on facing two carriers. Their strike on Midway had been armed with bombs for land targets. Now, his flight decks were a chaotic scene of ordnance carts and sweating deck crews, racing to swap the bombs for armor-piercing torpedoes for a naval attack. It was in the midst of this frantic, high-stakes activity that the true shock arrived, a shock that shattered their worldview more completely than any bomb ever could. As American aircraft began to appear on the horizon first, the obsolete Devastator torpedo bombers, which were swatted from the sky by the formidable Japanese combat air patrol, the reports from the Zero pilots started to paint an impossible picture. They were identifying not two, but three distinct American carriers. On the bridge of the Hairyuu, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi listened to the crackle of the radio with growing disbelief. It couldn't be. Their intelligence was perfect. Their spies in Hawaii, the radio intercepts, the pilot reports, everything confirmed. The Yorktown was at the bottom of the Coral Sea, or at best, laid up for months of repair in some West Coast shipyard. And yet, the reports were insistent. Then came the final, unbelievable confirmation. A Japanese pilot, banking away after a strafing run, got a clear look at the carrier, steaming confidently with the American task force. He saw the number painted on its island and bow, 5, CV5, the USS Yorktown. He radioed it in, his voice tight with confusion. The men on the Japanese bridges couldn't believe what they were hearing. It was a phantom, a ghost ship. The Americans, the soft, decadent merchants they had so thoroughly underestimated, had somehow done the impossible. The immediate aftermath of this revelation was a paralysis of disbelief, followed by a cascade of tactical errors. The entire foundation of Operation MI was built on a lie they had told themselves. The presence of the Yorktown didn't just add 1/3 more aircraft to the American order of battle. It fundamentally broke the Japanese leadership's OODA loop. Their ability to observe, orient, decide, and act. Nagumo, a cautious and by-the-book commander, was now hopelessly caught between two objectives. His planes from the Midway strike were returning, low on fuel and needing to land. His deck crews were still in the middle of rearming for a naval strike. And now, the enemy he thought he had hours to prepare for was already attacking him. The rigid, perfectly rehearsed Japanese plan had no room for this kind of improvisation. It had no answer for an enemy who refused to behave as predicted. The spiritual strength of Yamato Damashi was suddenly confronted by the brute force, pragmatic miracle of American industrial repair. As Nagumo hesitated, trying to reconcile the impossible reality with his flawed plans, the sky above the Kido Butai began to darken. It was the shadow of dozens of SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise and the ghost ship itself, the Yorktown. They had arrived at the precise moment of Japanese vulnerability, catching the carriers with their decks full of fueled and armed aircraft. The stunned silence on the Japanese bridges was shattered by the scream of diving planes, the thunder of exploding bombs, and the horrific, chain reaction-like immolation of their proudest carriers. The belief in their own invincibility, in the decadent weakness of their enemy, was incinerated in a matter of minutes. They were utterly shocked that the Americans could not only repair a carrier so fast, but also have it waiting in ambush for them. Their carefully laid trap had snapped shut, but on them, not the Americans. The miraculous resurrection of the USS Yorktown was not a one-time fluke, a lucky break born of desperation. It was the public debut of a new reality in naval warfare, a reality that the Japanese admirals, steeped in their tradition of warrior spirit and meticulously planned decisive battles, were completely unprepared for. The shock they felt on June 4th, 1942, would become the norm. The Americans had transformed the act of ship repair from a slow, methodical process into a dynamic and crucial element of their core warfighting strategy. The Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard, under the command of Rear Admiral William R. Furlong became the beating heart of this new system. It was no longer just a place where ships were fixed. It was a place where Japanese victories were systematically erased. The philosophy was simple and brutal. A damaged ship was not a liability to be towed away and forgotten. It was a resource to be thrown back into the fight as fast as humanly and mechanically possible. This system was a symphony of organized chaos. When a battered ship limped into port, it was immediately swarmed by an army of thousands of civilian workers. These weren't conscripted soldiers. They were highly skilled tradesmen, welders, pipe fitters, electricians, shipwrights, and engineers who worked with a relentless, patriotic fervor. They operated around the clock, under massive floodlights that turned night into day, their welding torches casting eerie, dancing shadows against the Hawaiian sky. They didn't wait for formal damage assessments to be completed. Teams swarmed a ship before the boilers were even cold, cutting away twisted steel while others were already fabricating replacement sections in the workshops ashore. There was no bureaucracy, only a singular, driving mission: get the ship fighting again. This industrial army, a force the Japanese planners had never factored into their equations of naval power, became one of America's most potent weapons. They were shocked to learn that the enemy's greatest strength wasn't just its sailors and pilots, but its seemingly inexhaustible supply of determined civilians with tool belts and blueprints. The case of the Yorktown remains the most stunning example of this system in action. When she limped into dry dock number 1 at Pearl Harbor on May 27, 1942, she was a wreck. A 250-kilogram bomb had pierced 3 decks before exploding, causing immense structural damage and starting fires that nearly consumed the ship. Her boilers were dead, her electrical systems a tangled mess, and her hull was a sieve. By any conventional standard, especially the meticulous, honor-bound standards of the Imperial Japanese Navy's shipyards at Kure or Yokosuka, she was a candidate for at least 3 months of major repairs. Admiral Nimitz, however, did not have 3 months. He had intelligence, cracked from Japanese naval codes, that Yamamoto's fleet was targeting Midway. He needed every flight deck he could get, and he needed them now. He walked the deck of the crippled carrier with his staff, and after a 2-hour inspection, he turned to his fleet maintenance officer and asked the impossible question, "We must have this ship back in 3 days. Can you do it?" The answer was a testament to the American can-do spirit. "Yes, sir." What followed was a miracle of controlled demolition and frantic reconstruction. An estimated 1,400 workers descended into the ship. They didn't bother with permanent, elegant fixes. They used wooden beams to shore up buckled decks instead of waiting for steel to be fabricated. They cut out entire sections of damaged wiring and simply ran new cables across the bulkheads. The most critical task was repairing the massive hole in the hull from the bomb hit. Instead of shaping new steel plates, which would take weeks, they used a sophisticated patch, bracing it from the inside. A solution intended to last just long enough. For 72 straight hours, the dry dock was a cacophony of riveting guns, grinding steel, and shouted orders. The workers, fueled by coffee and determination, did not stop. When the Yorktown steamed out of Pearl Harbor on May 30th, just 3 days after arriving, she was not pretty. She was a patched-up, scarred veteran, but her flight deck could launch and recover aircraft, her engines could make 25 knots, and she was, to the utter disbelief of the enemy who thought they had sunk her, battle-ready again. This philosophy of resurrection extended far beyond just the Yorktown. It became the signature of the Pacific Fleet. The Japanese pilots who had bombed Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier had returned to their carriers with triumphant photographs of sunken American battleships. The USS California, the USS West Virginia. These ships were on the bottom of the harbor, their masts angled forlornly above the oily water. In Japanese propaganda reels, they were the symbols of a victory so total it had broken the back of the American fleet. The Japanese public was shown these images again and again as proof of their navy's supremacy. So one can only imagine the profound psychological shock years later. In battles like the Surigao Strait in 1944, when Japanese sailors peered through their binoculars and saw these very same ships, the ghosts of Pearl Harbor, raining down a perfectly coordinated hell of 16-inch shells upon them, they couldn't believe their eyes. Ships they knew for a fact had been sunk were now back, more powerful than before, armed with advanced radar and bristling with anti-aircraft guns. The Americans had performed the ultimate act of naval necromancy. They had not only salvaged these massive vessels, a monumental engineering feat in itself, but had completely modernized and returned them to the front lines. The Japanese high command was stunned. Every victory they claimed, every ship they sank, seemed to be temporary. The Americans simply refused to let their ships stay dead. This pattern became even more terrifying when it shifted from repair to outright production. The Japanese were confident in their ability to build high-quality, complex warships. What they could not comprehend was America's ability to mass-produce them. The symbol of this industrial dominance was the escort carrier, or jeep carrier. These were not the elegant fleet carriers like the Shokaku or Enterprise. They were built on simple merchant marine hulls, small, slow, and unarmored. The Japanese initially laughed at them as crude, insignificant vessels. But then they just kept coming. Industrialist Henry Kaiser applied his revolutionary assembly line techniques to shipbuilding. At his yards, ships were not built piece by piece from the keel up. They were assembled from massive prefabricated modules. Entire bow sections, engine rooms, and superstructure components would be built simultaneously and then welded together in a fraction of the time. The results were staggering. At the peak of production, Kaiser's yards were launching a new carrier, on average every few weeks. For Japanese submarine commanders and pilots, it was a nightmare. They would sink one of these carriers in a hard-fought battle, only to encounter 3 more on their next patrol. It was a relentless, soul-crushing tide of steel that no amount of Yamato Damashi could hold back. The ultimate symbol of American power was not the battleship or the carrier. It was the dry dock and the shipyard slipway. These were the places where Japanese successes were rendered meaningless. The constant, 2-4-hour-a-day clang of hammers on steel became the true soundtrack of the Pacific War. The sound of an industrial giant methodically and relentlessly erasing its enemy's gains. The news of the disaster at Midway did not crash upon the Japanese high command like a tidal wave. It seeped in like a slow, cold poison. In the days following the battle, Admiral Yamamoto and his staff aboard the battleship Yamato were engulfed in a fog of confusing and contradictory reports. But as the remnants of Nagumo's once invincible Kido Butai limped back to Japan, the horrifying truth crystallized. 4 of the Empire's finest aircraft carriers, the very heart of the combined fleet, were gone. Hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots, the best of the best, were dead. The decisive battle they had so carefully engineered had indeed occurred, but it was an unmitigated catastrophe. The official reaction was one of profound institutional shock, followed immediately by a policy of total concealment. The defeat was so shattering, so contradictory to the entire narrative of Japanese martial supremacy, that the government could not allow its people to know the truth. The survivors of the battle were not welcomed home as heroes who had fought bravely, but were instead quarantined, their letters censored, and their contact with family restricted, lest the truth of the debacle leak out. The Japanese public was fed a steady diet of propaganda, told that Midway had been a great victory, but within the hushed corridors of the Imperial General Headquarters, the admirals were forced to confront a new and terrifying reality. The presence of the resurrected Yorktown was the central, indigestible fact in their after-action reports. It was a ghost that haunted their planning tables. It meant their intelligence was flawed, their enemy was more resilient than they could have possibly imagined, and their fundamental understanding of modern warfare was obsolete. They had brought a finely honed samurai sword to a fight against a factory that produced machine guns. The realization dawned that the war would not be a short, glorious affair decided by spirit and tactical brilliance. It was now a war of attrition, a grinding, brutal contest of industrial production, the very war that Yamamoto had warned from the beginning that Japan could not win. They were stunned into a state of strategic paralysis, their offensive momentum broken forever. Faced with this new, grim reality of America's industrial might and miraculous powers of repair, the Japanese military was forced to abandon its grand offensive designs and scramble for a response. Their countermeasures became increasingly desperate. a series of tactical and technological gambles aimed at offsetting their now obvious material inferiority. If they could not outproduce the Americans, they would have to outthink them or outdie them. Technologically, they accelerated the development of new aircraft, like the Kawanishi N-1K Shiden, a superb fighter designed to challenge the new American F-6F Hellcat. But for every one Shiden that rolled out of a Japanese factory, a dozen Hellcats were being pushed out of Grumman's ironworks on Long Island. They poured resources into building armored carriers like the Taiho, but it was a single, exquisite ship entering a battle against an entire fleet of mass-produced American Essex-class carriers. Their most significant strategic shift was on the ground. Realizing they could no longer hope to win a decisive victory at sea, they adopted a strategy of attrition. They would turn every island they held into a meat grinder. The garrisons on places like Tarawa, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima were ordered to build intricate networks of bunkers, tunnels, and fortified positions, and to fight to the last man. The new goal was not to win, but to make the cost of each American victory so horrifically high in blood and treasure that the soft, decadent American public would lose the will to continue. But this strategy failed because it was based on the same flawed premise as their pre-war thinking, that American resolve was brittle. They never understood that each bloody battle, far from discouraging the Americans, only hardened their resolve to see the war through to unconditional surrender. The ultimate and most horrifying countermeasure was the formal adoption of suicide tactics. The kamikaze, the divine wind, was the final, desperate admission of conventional defeat. By late 1944, Japanese naval planners had coldly calculated that it was more effective to use a minimally trained pilot in a bomb-laden plane as a guided missile than to have him shot down by swarms of Hellcats and the impenetrable wall of anti-aircraft fire thrown up by American warships. It was the only way they could guarantee a hit. The kamikaze was the logical endpoint of a warrior creed confronted by an industrial machine it could not defeat. For the average Japanese sailor, pilot, or soldier, this strategic unraveling translated into a slow-motion psychological collapse. The man who had joined the Navy in 1941 was filled with an unshakable sense of pride and a belief in his own invincibility. He was part of the force that had humbled the Americans at Pearl Harbor and swept across the Pacific. But by 1943, that man was gone, replaced by a weary survivor haunted by a sense of dread. He experienced the American industrial advantage not as a strategic concept, but as a relentless, soul-crushing reality. From the cockpit of his Zero in the skies over the Solomon Islands, he would engage in a dogfight, skillfully shooting down an American plane, only to see his wingmen picked off one by the sheer number of enemy fighters. For every American plane he saw fall, 5 more seemed to take its place. He would participate in a night naval action, watching his Long Lance torpedoes strike home and sink an American cruiser, only to learn months later that the Americans had already launched 6 new, more powerful cruisers to replace it. The psychological turning point for many was the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, a battle the Americans would nickname the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Young, hastily trained Japanese pilots were sent up in waves against the veteran American aviators of Task Force 58. It was a slaughter. The Japanese lost over 600 aircraft and 2 carriers in a single day. It was no longer a battle, it was an execution. The Yamato Damashi spirit, the belief that spiritual power could overcome material disadvantage, was shredded in the face of an enemy who had both overwhelming material advantage and a hardened, battle-tested fighting spirit of their own. The feeling was one of utter futility, of being trapped in a nightmare from which there was no awakening. They were fighting a monster that healed its wounds in days, and whose strength grew with every battle. The constant clang of American shipyard hammers, thousands of miles away, echoed in the mind of every Japanese serviceman, sounding the death knell of his empire. The story of the USS Yorktown and its 72-hour resurrection is more than just a tale of incredible ship repair. It is the perfect metaphor for the entire industrial and moral conflict between the Empire of Japan and the United States. The Japanese High Command went to war believing they were fighting a nation of individuals. They were shocked to discover they were fighting a system, a vast, interconnected web of democratic and industrial power that could absorb devastating blows, adapt, and return stronger than before. They never truly understood that America's power did not reside in its standing army or its navy at any given moment, but in its ability to generate new power, to transform civilian potential into military might at a speed and scale the world had never seen. The Japanese naval doctrine was one of perfection. They built exquisite ships, like the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, marvels of engineering that took years to construct. They trained their pilots to a razor's edge of skill over a decade. Their entire philosophy was based on conserving these perfect, finite assets and using them in one flawless, decisive blow. The American system was the complete opposite. It was a philosophy of mass production, of good enough being a winning strategy when you could produce it in overwhelming quantities. The Sherman tank was not as good as a German Tiger, but for every Tiger on the field, the Americans could field 50 Shermans. The F-6F Hellcat was a simple, rugged machine, easy to produce and easy to fly, but it was built in such vast numbers that it swept the superior but less numerous Japanese Zero from the skies. The admirals in Tokyo were stunned because they were professional warriors who had spent their lives studying naval tactics, and they were defeated by men they never even considered their opponents. The civilian factory managers, the union welders, the engineers, and the thousands of ordinary American men and women on the assembly lines. The true decisive battle was not fought at Midway or Leyte Gulf. It was won years earlier in the shipyards of Newport News, the aircraft plants of Long Island, and the steel mills of Pittsburgh. The ultimate demonstration of this overwhelming industrial victory was not a single battle, but a place. By late 1944, the forward anchorage for the U.S. Pacific Fleet was a remote, once-forgotten coral lagoon in the Caroline Islands called Ulithi Atoll. For any Japanese reconnaissance pilot, lucky or unlucky enough to get a glimpse of it, the sight would have been a vision of apocalyptic power, a spectacle so vast it would defy belief. Spread across the placid blue water, stretching from horizon to horizon, was the largest armada in human history. Here were not 10 or 20 ships, but over 700. Fleet carriers, light carriers, escort carriers, new battleships, old battleships, resurrected from the mud of Pearl Harbor, cruisers, destroyers, and a colossal fleet of tankers, ammunition ships, and supply vessels. It was a floating city, a mobile projection of American power that dwarfed anything the world had ever seen. But the most shocking sight for a Japanese observer would not have been the warships. It would have been the floating dry docks, massive, self-propelled structures capable of lifting a crippled cruiser or even a battleship out of the water for repairs, right there in the forward area, thousands of miles from any home port. This was the final evolution of the Pearl Harbor miracle. The Americans had not only perfected the art of rapid repair, they had packed up their shipyards and brought them to the front line. The Japanese strategy of turning islands into fortresses to bleed the Americans dry was rendered moot when the Americans could simply bypass them and bring their own floating bases with them. This was a force that didn't just win battles. It changed the very geography of war. There was no countermeasure to this. There was no spiritual answer to a navy that could repair its own battle damage on the spot and continue fighting the next day. This was checkmate, rendered in 10 million tons of steel. The final verdict of the war was delivered on September 2nd, 1945, in the calm waters of Tokyo Bay. The setting was the deck of the USS Missouri, one of the new Iowa-class battleships that had been laid down after the war began, a vessel whose very existence was a product of the industrial might Japan had so fatally underestimated. As the Japanese delegation, somber in their formal attire, stepped aboard, they were greeted by a vista of pure, unanswerable power. The bay was crowded with the ships of the Allied fleet, a silent, grey testament to the industrial engine that had crushed their empire. For men like Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, who signed the instrument of surrender, it was the final, bitter acknowledgement of a reality they had ignored for too long. Their ideology of spiritual strength and martial glory had promised them a swift, heroic victory. Instead, it had led them to utter ruin. They had believed the American spirit was soft, only to find it was a pragmatic, stubborn resolve that hardened under pressure. They had laughed at America as a nation of merchants, only to be buried by the products of its factories. The great irony of the Pacific War is that the Japanese military, which prized the intangible spirit of the warrior above all else, was ultimately defeated by the most tangible thing imaginable: the sheer, relentless, overwhelming weight of American production. The admirals who were stunned by the reappearance of the Yorktown at Midway were witnessing the opening chapter of their own demise. They thought they were fighting a ship, but they were fighting a shipyard, and in a war of shipyards, the outcome was never truly in doubt.